إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
The next topic here within this session on the Mabrazi and the Sirah is looking at the historical context for the Isnad system. Right? And this is sort of our main focus in this session. Right? Now when we talk about the Isnad system, we have to realize that we are talking about two different aspects. Right? There's a theological premise and there's a historical premise. Right? So when we say, how is knowledge transmitted? How is knowledge about Prophet Muhammad transmitted? How is knowledge about the Sahaba transmitted? How does knowledge go from one generation to the next? Okay? And particularly within the context of the oral phase of transmission. Because we know for sure, and we have evidence, right, in actual documents, ancient manuscripts, written by various people, right, scholars and others, other Muslims, right, very, clearly by the end of the first Islamic century, but going into the second Islamic century, we start to have more and more written works. And here what we're talking about is what is referred to as the extant manuscripts. So an ancient manuscript that you could find in a library, written on ancient papyrus or whatever, and you could hold this and you could look at it and you could read it and you could see that this was written by a certain human being in the second Islamic century, in the 8th century. Right? And so from the 2nd, 8th century, we just have an extensive amount of manuscripts. Right? Now the question that we're going to look at to a certain extent is, how do you go from the oral tradition, no writing, no manuscripts, nothing, right? Even a certain emphasis or practice of the Sahaba not to write anything down. Right? Part of that oral tradition was that you memorize and absorb that information and you pass it on through word of mouth. Right? And so many of the Sahaba would not write anything down, intentionally not write anything down. Others wrote some things down. Right? But we don't have those extant manuscripts from that early period. Right? Now, this presents a certain problem and resolution of the problem within Muslim scholarship, and then it's going to create a different set of problems and resolution to the problems in a Western secular historical perspective. So this is what we'll take a look at. But the theological issue, right, as I pointed out in our general introduction to the lecture series, is this critical issue. Right? What is the Islamic perspective? What theological understanding, theological assumptions are there? What's the secular perspective? Right? And what are the assumptions of the secular perspective? Right? So the theological perspective, of course, for Muslims is that Muhammad is protected. What we call he was ma'soom. He had the isma. Right? So this is the first point. Okay, that as Muslims we believe Muhammad did not lie or distort or hold back information, right, or give incorrect information about anything, whether it was his receiving the revelation, reception of the Quran from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Jibreel, coming to him, and then his reciting of the Quran to the companions, right, in a perfect, protected, undistorted recitation of that Quran. And the Sahaba heard this, memorized it, absorbed it, right, assimilated it into their whole life, right, and then they accurately transmitted that. Right. But it's not just the Quran. Right. Muhammad as Ma'soom, right, sallallahu means that everything he did, all of his actions from the time that revelation began, right, until his death, everything he did, everything he said was under the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He didn't speak out of his own whims, his own desires. Right? So this is a critical theological point. Right? From the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the belief in revelation, to all the prophets, right? From Adam up until Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the belief that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the infallible, right? The protected, the ma'soom prophet and messenger, right? Who accurately conveyed all of Allah's will. Not just Allah's speech, not just kalam Allah, right? Not just the words of the Quran, but everything that Allah has willed for the human being to know in order to successfully enter Jannah has been conveyed to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he has conveyed it perfectly to his companions. And they absorb it perfectly, and they pass it on to the next generation. And this is what becomes the Sunnah. And this is what is passed on through the Isnad system. Right? And the Sunnah, of course, is extensive, and we're looking at the Marazi and the Sirah in that historical perspective. Okay, so meaning, again, just to clarify, the extra Quranic teachings, meaning all of Muhammad's Sunnah. So he has the Quran and he has the Sunnah. He has the Quran, he has an explanation of a verse or verses. He has the Quran and he has his behavior, his actions that manifest perfectly what that verse is supposed to mean or how you're supposed to act upon it. So the Quran and everything other than the Quran, right, or his whole Sunnah are divinely revealed and thus establish the so-called normative behavior. How Muslims are supposed to behave is based on the Quran and the Sunnah. Right? As soon as you drive a wedge between the Quran and the Sunnah, as soon as you cast doubt that Muhammad somehow didn't speak perfectly and protect it, right? Then you could say the edifice of Islam starts to crumble. So this is a key foundation. Right? This is the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Right? This is the understanding that we hold on to. Right? Because it comes from the Aqidah, it comes from the theology, and it gets passed down into the actuality in history. Okay? Now the second theological premise, as I already indicated, is a concept that the companions, the Sahaba, form a unique generation of Muslims who were entrusted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to absorb, maintain, and transmit the Sunnah. Right? This occurred in a primarily illiterate community that relied on the oral transmission of knowledge. Right? So Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioned in the Quran. He's a Nabi Ummi. He's the illiterate prophet. Right? He didn't know how to read and write. Most of the Arabs didn't know how to read or write. They barely even had a script that they used. Okay, so there's a truly illiterate society. Okay? Now we could talk about later on maybe why, what are the benefits, what's the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala generating, you might say, and raising up the final revelation in this context. Right? And as we look through the history, at least from that perspective, we'll see that we'll see some aspects of the wisdom. Right? Why doesn't Islam come out of the Byzantine Empire? Why doesn't Islam come out of the Persian Empire? Right? Why doesn't Islam come out of some well-established empire, civilization that had been in existence for hundreds, maybe thousands of years? Why does it come out of an illiterate, basically Bedouin society of Arabs, right, who had almost no contact with the rest of the world? The Arabs lived in Arabia, and they had very limited contact with anybody outside of their society. So there's a wisdom there from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why Islam comes out of the region it comes out. But the Sahaba formed this unique generation. Right? And a major belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that all of the Sahaba, right, we have to accept them all, love them all, right, and look at them all as a group performing this vital function. Right? Because Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know, he was a human being, he has died, right? He doesn't live on to continually give revelation. So they kind of said the baton is passed, so to say, to the Sahaba. Right? So they have to form this unique generation. Now, part of that, of course, is we don't believe that any particular companion is ma'sum. Right? Later on, we'll talk about some of the deviant groups and groups that say, Ali is infallible, or other claims that were made. But we don't say that any of the Sahaba are ma'sum. They're not protected as an individual where they are perfect and infallible and can do nothing wrong. Right? But collectively, as a group, they hold this unique status. And the information that they pass on, and we know that they made mistakes, they corrected each other, they had disputes with each other, and this is all part of the history that we have to understand. Okay? And so, as a group, what are the Sahaba doing? They're passing on the totality of what Muhammad ﷺ had revealed and conveyed. Right? So that's that point. Okay. Now, what are some of the implications of this, you might say? What are some of the consequences of this? Right. Although the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, right, the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, are a historical reality, the nature of the historical premises revolve around the transmission of knowledge from the companions to the followers, like the Tabi'un. And from this latter group to the third generation, or what we usually refer to as the Tabi'ut Tabi'in. So the Tabi'un, the second generation followers, the third generation Tabi'ut Tabi'in, they are of important status, but they're not of the status of the Sahaba. But they do play this critical role of this transmission of knowledge. And it's really with the Tabi'un, and then clearly with the third generation Tabi'ut Tabi'in, that we have the emergence of written material. So as I said, many of the Sahaba did not like to write anything down. Okay. Their understanding of Islam is that you memorize it, you absorb it, it becomes part of your heart and mind and soul, and that is the reality of the religion. Even many of the Tabi'un disliked writing things down, or many of them kept notes, and they used those notes to refresh their memories, and when they gave lectures, when they gave talks, they spoke from memory. Right? They didn't have notes in front of them. Right? By the third generation, we see books and notes and writings becoming more and more common. Right? Although still the tradition of memorization and passing on that information from memory remains critical. And this really is another important issue. The question of the accuracy of the memory of the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. And this is something, again, that modern Western scholarship simply rejects, that somebody could memorize perfectly lengthy hadith, or memorize and report accurately events that have happened. Okay? But we know this is true. We know that we'll see later on, the pre-Islamic Arabs had tremendous capacity to memorize genealogies, epic poems, the Ayam al-Arab, and all these different things, memorization of the Quran, and the hadith scholars, memorizing thousands and thousands of hadith. So there's a credibility issue. From the Islamic perspective, we know that the memorization of vast amounts of information, accurately and precisely, was the reality. If you question that and cast doubt on that, then again, the edifice starts to crumble. So you have this transmission of knowledge. It continues, as I said, through this generations. It moves from an oral tradition to the written tradition. But this issue of the transmission of knowledge also includes this, what we call epistemology. Right? This, the sort of philosophical question of how do we know what we know? How do we know anything is real? How do we know, that we are real, that the things around us are real? How do we know any event of the past is real? How do we acquire information? How do we know things? All right? And Muslim scholars were very clearly concerned about this issue. Right? For issues of the tafsir of the Quran, issues of the fiqh, the legal issues of the transmission of knowledge of the hadith. Right? And so we see in the writings of Muslims in the 2nd, 8th century, 3rd, 9th century, 4th, 10th century, they're constantly dealing with this question. How do we know what we know? How do we know that Allah revealed this? How do we know that this is the right interpretation of the verse? How do we know that this is the correct ruling, right, in a fiqh issue, right? That this is what is pleasing to Allah, right? Because this is also that theological issue. Muslims were and are concerned with that central question. Am I doing what is pleasing to Allah? How do I know that this is pleasing to Allah, this particular action? The way I pray, the way I fast, the way I do this, the way I do that. How do I know that this is pleasing to Allah? Because if it's not pleasing to Allah, the action is meaningless. The action has no weight in the hereafter. Right? So the Muslims were, you might say, in some ways, primarily concerned with this question in a sort of philosophical sense. Right? How do we know what we know? And they sought certainty. They asked these questions. They wrote extensively on this topic. How do we achieve certainty of knowledge or near certainty? Right? If absolute perfect certainty is not possible in the human being, who is flawed, who is temporal, who is finite, at least the human being can achieve near certainty. Right? So this is not a question that was overlooked by the Muslims. In fact, it was something that Muslims, you might say, dove into very seriously.